We now run a weekly membership program with Bernardo Kastrup that you can join at withrealityinmind.com. This includes weekly Q&As, special guests like Rupert Spira, Michael Levin, Federico Fagin. There's an international, vibrant community of researchers, academics, meditators, mystics, philosophers, poets, creatives, musicians, anyone that wants to deeply understand this philosophy and its potential implications for their lives. In this next clip, Bernardo explains his motivation for wanting to start this program, which include helping anyone that wants to deeply understand this, but also helping anyone that wants to become an ambassador for idealism.
For me, personally, helping create not only a community, I'm not trying to do activism here, I'm not trying to build an army of analytic idealists, but creating a community in which a deeper understanding of idealism in general, perhaps analytic idealism in particular, because that's what I can offer more, but a community around idealism that truly and deeply understands what it is, more than the average person who has heard about analytic idealism. I'm still getting today, after 15 years, mostly the same questions I used to get in year one. So progress in the world at large is very slow, but within a sort of a nurtured community, I think we can achieve a lot more, go a lot more in depth. And to use a word I used with Amir when we were discussing this, I don't know whether it's a goal or just a wish, so I'll keep it as a wish. I would like to help foment a community of ambassadors of idealism, people who will be equipped to go out into their communities, go into the world, and not preach analytic idealism, but when the subject comes up, they will be a sort of a source of light, an informed source of clarifications, of arguments, of reason, basically, a source of reason in their communities. And maybe that starts something that grows organically. By nature, I'm also a natural introvert. So playing a public role is fairly unnatural to me. It's something I can do because I learned, life forces you very early on to behave like an extrovert in science, in the corporate world, and especially when you're a book writer, you have to put your face out there and talk to people, confront the world. But by nature, I am an introvert, and so, and this may sound a little bit egocentric. Maybe it is. It would be nice to have more voices out there, so I could feel more comfortable myself to allow myself to disappear in my Swiss Alps mountain every now and then, knowing that there is a whole group of people out there who are carrying the torch still. So yeah, those were my sincere motivations for this. You could argue that it is almost statistically certain that there is a lot of stuff going on out there that we just didn't evolve to pick out. Who controls their fears? Who controls their next thoughts? Who even controls their daydreaming fantasies? These things happen to us, but we have this feeling that we are the agent behind them, and therefore they are not threatening. From the point of view of nature, whatever nature is doing, it's doing it to itself. From that perspective, it's always morally good because it's not putting anybody else through suffering. It's doing it to itself.
So I actually just invited people to go to breakout rooms whilst we were waiting. So I'm just going to, just so they could chat. So I'll just call everyone back. That'll take about 60 seconds. What is the design you were doing? Sorry.
Well, we started this AI hardware company at the
Oh,
end of the
wow.
summer. So we are basically designing a AI processor right now, and then we have to build a system of processors. But we needed to have a first, working, basically a sketch of the processor working at the gate level, so we knew what it's all about. And now for the next months, we are going to iterate on it and optimize it. But the first thing run yesterday at 3:11 a.m. local time here. So it came to life.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
And that's nothing to do with Essentia, I imagine. This is like a...
Now it's parallel. It does have to do with Essentia, because the whole metaphysical discussion about the nature of mind is going to now take place in the mainstream under the umbrella of AI. So from Essentia Foundation's perspective, it is related, but there is no legal, juridical link between the two activities. The link is me and a board member. That's it.
Uh-huh. And this technology will help show that AI is not conscious.
Mm. This technology is meant to make AI a lot more efficient, an order or two magnitudes cheaper and consuming the same order less power. But if it becomes the technology of choice, then the people who build it know exactly how it was built, and they also have an understanding of integrated information theory, and they will be able to tell people um, in a very analytically and empirically based manner whether we have any reasons to think it is conscious or not. And so that would be the second goal. First, we have to win the AI race. So we are in a very strong position in the culture, and then we'll take the next step. But for now, we need to enter the race. That's what we are trying to do now.
Okay, well, congratulations on that first step. Um, just for anyone who was in breakout rooms in that last part of the conversation, Bernardo's been working very hard on launching a new or a test, is it, for a like a prototype?
Yeah, the company we launched, we were testing the first processor design, and it became alive yesterday at 3:11 a.m.
Mm, great.
And it's a
Uh,
metaphor, and it's not alive, please. But it's running code. It's running neural network code since yesterday at 3:11 a.m.
yeah, you're gonna have to be increasingly careful with the metaphors.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm finding that as well. I've been studying anatomy and physiology from like traditional textbooks that are very materialistic in their outlook. But the metaphor of conscious direction is interwoven in almost every sentence. So the
Yeah,
cell knows this and it's trying to do this, and what this cell wants is that, and this molecule is really trying to get here.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's
It's
almost no other
pervasive.
way to, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also in math, in engineering. It's a pervasive metaphor.
Hmm. Okay, so there might be some questions left over from last week, which we'll come back to. But there's a question that people are really curious to hear you discuss from Timothy. Also, just to say, so in case you missed it, Bernardo's mentioned that he's very tired, having launched this thing. He probably needs a good 12-hour sleep, so we'll try finish on time today. And I'm also just recovering from a cold, so I might get Fawn or someone to read some of the questions if people aren't reading their own questions. But Timothy, if you're here,
Yes, thank you. Good evening.
Good evening, Timothy.
So I would like to ask this question, which is an honor for me again. As a Jungian psychiatrist, this is not about me, but I need to put a little context. I recently have submitted to the European Psychiatric Association an idea explicitly based on your metaphysical view. Usually, schizophrenia is considered in neuroscience and in general biological psychiatry as the sum of its greatest symptoms, which are hallucinations and delusions. But phenomenological psychiatry and clinical observation shows clearly that these symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, are but the tip of the iceberg in schizophrenia. They are not the core of the experiential phenomenon. Actually, they arguably they compensate for a threatening feeling that everything is consciousness. Why is this feeling threatening? That's because it's not consciously or meta-consciously approached. It's lived, it's underwent, kind of.
Yeah.
So analytic idealism might foster a new terrain of encounter, really of psychotherapeutic encounter with psychotic patients, which is a challenge in psychiatry, without denying their suffering, because phenomenology somehow tends to deny suffering, saying schizophrenia is just not an illness. Would you kindly express your feeling and your thought about this idea, if you may? Thank you very much for your attention.
Sure. Well, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so you have to take what I'm about to say with like a bag of salt, not only a pinch. My layman's understanding of schizophrenia, in other words, this top level appearances that you discussed, delusions and the psychosis, the hallucinations, the way I naively look upon that and try to sort of come up with a little model for myself without pretensions that this model is right or without pretensions to write a paper or anything, but it's my own inner narrative, is that in my experience, not only introspectively, but in observing other people's behavior, is that we are all a collective anyway. And IIT sort of bases this. There are multiple complexes running within us. It's just that the reporting ego happens to be one of those complexes, but there are others running in parallel. So we are a collective anyway. But what characterizes this unified state of consciousness we seem to have is the feeling of agency. We recognize ourselves as the agent behind our thoughts, our fantasies, our wishes, our fears. They are not experienced as something coming from the outside. They are experienced as something that we are the agents of, and therefore they are not threatened. We have a sense of control, even though, you know, clinically speaking, we don't really have control. Who controls their fears? Who controls their next thoughts? Who even controls their daydreaming fantasies? These things happen to us, but we have this feeling that we are the agent behind them, and therefore they are not threatening. You can imagine that if that feeling of agency becomes dissociated from some of our own fantasies, some of our own worries, then those fantasies become hallucinations. Those worries become paranoia, delusions, and even though they are produced by the same mechanisms that produce our daydreams, or our wishes, or our worries, our concerns. So that's my sort of naive view of it. You went deeper. You're saying that at the root of these varied symptomatology, there is a core cause, which may be this notion that everything is agential, everything has agency. So it's not only that we are not the agents behind that stuff. There is another agent that is conscious. And I recognize it. I hadn't thought about it before. I only thought about it after you explained your question. But my first intuition is, yeah, this makes sense, because now you have two things going on here. Not only is it, not only am I not the agent behind those things, there is another agent, and that can be very concerning. So yeah, I think at first sight it's reasonable. Would idealism specifically endorse it? Surely, under idealism, there is a conscious agent behind everything. It's just that the boundaries of those agency may not correspond to the boundaries of objects, and most likely don't. In the same way that the boundaries of our agency doesn't correspond to the boundaries of one neuron in your head. But behind that neuron, there is an agent, even though the agent spans many more neurons. So in the same sense, behind every object, there is an agent, even though that agent goes, spans beyond the boundaries of objects. But at the same time, you could argue that even without a metaphysical choice, even without endorsing analytic idealism. Even if you stay strictly scientific and don't go into metaphysics, don't go into ontology, don't go into philosophy, um, IIT could still substantiate this hypothesis very well. While you remain metaphysically neutral, you could say there are other complexes in the nervous system of a person or corresponding to the nervous system of a person. We are not unitary. This unity of consciousness is a kind of illusion. We know it because when we go to sleep, that unit doesn't seem to be there, and yet we are not dead. You know? We are still experiencing our dreams. We experience sleep thinking. We experience subliminal perceptions during dreamless sleep. So if you want to make a proposal that avoids metaphysics, I think it would still fly. I mean, I'm speaking against analytic idealism now, but I'm too committed to what is true to try to sell my fish under any circumstances. I think you can substantiate it with IIT. And if the idea is to get a grant, that probably will make it a lot easier for you to get a grant if you know stay grounded in IIT, because IIT will say precisely that. Yes, there is a sentient agent behind every experience that the ego does not have a sense of ownership of. And therefore, the agent is other from the point of view of the reporting ego. And therefore, it's threatening. Even though it's you, it's another piece of you. So I think that would hold water, even with IIT alone, only science.
Thank you very much. It was very precious.
Kiran?
Yeah.
Hey, Kiran.
Hi, Bernardo. I hope your back is better.
It's getting better. Yeah.
Good. Good. So I have a very wide question for you, but I just would like to hear your thoughts on it. I don't think it's anything that's knowable, really, in a sense, but I'd love to hear you speak about all the words I'm going to use now are going to be wrong, but I speak about the world beyond the cockpit, the world before space-time, before the senses. You would say that anything in the world that we perceive symbolically represents something in the fundamental world, but we're not talking about the infinite field of potential. We're talking about the world unfolding and how it is. And I know you know a little bit about fairy folklore and stuff. And the interesting thing, when in Ireland, when they refer to the fairies, they're in the other world, but they're here. They have a presence. Like you would never say. People in Ireland, they call the fairies Nadini Maha Nadini Uishla, the good people or the noble people. But it's on the understanding that they're wary of them and they think they can be heard. Definitely at some points in the year, they have more presence, but they're always here. It's just the unperceived world. And also, I know you referred at a time when we were discussing UAPs and how these entities seem to appear in different ways at different times or apparent times in human history. And it's almost as if whatever these entities may be, because we're also in that world, that they can potentially control how we perceive them or present themselves in different ways. And that also ties into fairy folklore about changelings and things. So I just would love to hear. I don't think we could know. We are the dream characters. We can't step out of the dream, but I'm sure you've thought about it.
Of course. Well, you know, I thought about it because we talked about it.
Yeah.
Well, the strict answer is from an analytical perspective, there's nothing really we can say because all of our analytics instrumentation is grounded on the paradigm of the dashboard, the dimensions of the dashboard, the relationships across dials. And now that we are trying to say something about what is behind the dashboard, the thing that is measured in the first place, and then we don't have words and we don't even have the logic for it because Aristotelian logic, insofar as it is empirical and it's largely empirical, it also presupposes the paradigm, the parameters of the dashboard. So even logic fails us, which anybody who studies the fairy folk or the UAP experiences will sort of recognize. They don't follow logic. They don't follow Aristotelian logic. Jacques Vallée talks about meta-logic. They do follow a logic, but it's not what you get to see. You have to see beyond the appearances to understand that there is another logic behind the seeming absurdity, the seeming strangeness, that there is a metalogic behind that, that you recognize if you study many different reports and many different witness reports. So that makes sense to me. Now, there are two things to say. One is, suppose that the world behind the dashboard does not have any invisible dissociated complex like a living creature. Suppose we can perceive all actively enforced dissociative complexes, in other words, living beings. And then behind the dashboard, there is nothing that has an individual agency. There are only the impersonal mental processes of mind at large that appear to us in the form that we call the physical world. That's one hypothesis. But it immediately raises the question, what reason do we have to believe this hypothesis? And you will quickly find that there is very little reason. The only thing you have going for it is our own preference. We would like to think that there is nothing living with an individuated agency that cannot be perceived, but from an evolutionary perspective, our sensors and our dashboards have evolved to pick out what is relevant to our survival, that which has a bearing for our ability to persist and reproduce. Whatever does not have a direct bearing on us, or a mild bearing, would not have been fixed by natural selection, because there's just no incentive for it. It would just incur extra metabolic cost and not lead to any extra fitness. So from that perspective, you could argue that it is almost statistically certain that there is a lot of stuff going on out there that we just didn't evolve to pick out. And then some naive people would say, well, but that's why we have instruments, right? We can see beyond the visible spectrum into the ultraviolet and the infrared. We can magnify things so we can see the microscopic world. We have all kinds of sensors. Now, all of that is still being filtered through the dashboard because we still need to perceive the output of those instruments. So we are still strictly following the paradigm of the dashboard. We just made sure that the ranges of the dials is now a little bit extended, but we are still looking at dials. We're always, ever, only looking at dials. So the hypothesis here is that there may be something out there, and statistically there almost certainly is, that is incommensurable with the sensors and dials we have. It's just incommensurable. It has no touching point. Now, we have more cognitive faculties than the five senses. The five senses may be reliable to some extent. We still have optical illusions and auditory hallucinations and all that. But some would argue they are more reliable than intuition. Intuition can really lead us astray. I would argue that what leads us astray is that we mistake fantasizing for intuition. But the intuition, the real thing, is quite reliable, at least with some people. So it is possible that some people have a weak enough dissociative boundary, or they find themselves in a state in which the dissociative boundary becomes naturally more porous, permeable, and they pick out things that are incommensurable with the dashboard because it's a process that bypasses the dashboard. It goes straight through the dissociative boundary. And once they pick it up, their cognitive system will try to make sense of it. And it will inevitably then dress it up with the symbolic language, that is rooted in their own history, in their own experience. And that's why today we see space aliens, and in the past we would see green elves dressed in military fatigues. We dress this stuff according to the symbols we have at hand, given our culture, our history, which is the best our cognitive system can do in order for us to be able to speak of it to even ourselves, let alone to somebody else. So yes, it stands to reason that the fairy folk may correspond to a reality as real as my speaking to you right now, as the computer screen in front of you, or the symbolic mandala, the Irish mandala behind your head. Um, I do not discard that. And I would even go further. I think it cannot be a sustained collective hallucination that people have been talking about this for the entirety of recorded human history. It is not a fad, that surely it is not. It must be grounded in something that is indeed apprehended. It may not be literally what it purports to be, but it may be very real. And in the UAP stories, um, they do seem to be able to directly interface with our cognitive systems, so to project a certain image. Um, it is conceivable. Now we have to ask, do we have any direct reasons to believe it? I will not answer that question, but it is conceivable that if there are dissociated entities out there, that because of the cognitive ecosystem in which they live, it was never an advantage for them to become severely dissociated, that they are only mildly dissociated, and therefore they can have more or less direct cognitive access to their surroundings. If that is the case, it stands to reason that it would be easier for them to mess up with our cognition directly than we can mess up with each other's cognition. Because in our case, we have to go through two strong dissociative boundaries. In their case, it's only one. Assuming that theirs is porous and assuming that they have been around long enough to not be so naive about the nature of reality as we are, because we exclude all kinds of possibilities about how to relate to the world, how to develop technology, because we live this materialist paradigm. If you have never fallen for that trap, uh, then you are at least 400 years ahead of us in figuring out, how to manipulate the degrees of freedom of nature to get what you want and follow your own moral book, which may be very different from ours. Um, I think it is almost certain that what goes by the name as the fairy folk is true, is real, is around now, and has been around since much before, long before us. And their moral book is such that they seem to have a policy of minimum interference. It's good for us, because the monkeys are going haywire. If you don't have a moral book that says leave the monkeys alone, goodness knows what would be of us at this point. Maybe we will get to that point. Maybe we'll set up a nuclear fire so serious that the other agencies that call this planet home will say, well, wait a moment, until here and no further. Here you stop, you crazy monkeys.
And how do you imagine, independent of entities or potential, how do you imagine the world before perception, the world before space-time? You know that quote, a Zen monk, I can't remember, but the quote is, one being appearing as 10,000 things.
Yeah.
Is it that in the world, the fundamental world, for want of a better word, is it one being appearing as 10,000 mental things that are then symbolically represented by apparent physicality in this world?
Well, the 10,000 things would be the ways in which we dress it up with our cognitive system to try to make sense of it, right? I don't think the thing in itself is 10,000 things necessarily. It is what it is, and it can't be other than what it is. So how can we visualize what is out there if there is no spatio-temporal extension? By the way, the fairy folk, I think they have their own version of spatio-temporal extension, because if they are dissociated conscious agents, they also have to organize the data they gather about their surroundings in some way. So they also have to have some kind of filing system. And in our case, it's what we call space-time. They would have something like that too, even though it may not be one-on-one a match with ours. But if if we're talking about things and not dissociated agencies out there, the world as it is before extension, in other words, the world as it actually is, then you have to imagine structure without extension. Structure that does not require distances in space, geometrical relationships, and does not require time elapsed. How can we imagine that? Because if there is no space and no time, then everything sort of collapses together in some kind of singularity, and a singularity has no structure. Well, the structure is a cognitive structure. You may be in a sensory deprivation chamber in which your very sense of space and time sort of start disappearing, but you would still have ideas, and those ideas would have a cognitive structure. The idea of milk may relate to the idea of mother, which may relate to the idea of nurturing, which may relate to the idea of a birthday party as a kid, which may relate to the idea of bright colors. And so these cognitive associations are a structure. They are what they are and not something else they could be, but they do not require spatio-temporal extension because they are associations of meaning. They are semantic associations, not geometrical or temporal associations. So I think the world as it is out there, the very world we are observing right now, as it is in itself, it's not another world, it's the world where we live, where we have always been and will always be. That world is a unfathomable semantic structure that can be traversed cognitively. And I put traverse between scare quotes because to traverse seems to presuppose a space, and then that's not what we're talking about. On the contrary, right? It's an unfathomable database of meaning and their associations. That's how I would visualize it. So from the perspective of being the world, as opposed to perceiving the world. We were the world before we were born, we will be the world after we die. From the perspective of being the world, whatever has been is, whatever will be is, and whatever is there is here. Try to visualize that. You can't do that spatio-temporally, so you cannot create a picture in your head. The only way to visualize that is to imagine links of meaning. A semantic structure, like the crystal of eternity, which is a lattice of meaning associations. And what we call space-time is a slit that sort of traverses that structure and allows us to organize data about the world. For instance, the data we call the past is not data that we should spend energy to act upon because it's spilled milk, it's water under the bridge. And data about things that we say are far away is also data that we do not have an evolutionary advantage to act upon because it will have less of a bearing in our survival than the data that we categorize, that we store in the drawer called near. So that's how we organize data in order to limit our energy expenditure, the expenditure of attention in order to survive. It's very useful, but it only exists here in this state. And after we are no longer dissociated, we stay right here. There's no, where are you going to go when there is no space? Where do you think you're going to go? You're going to stay where you have always been, but you are not going to organize your cognitive surroundings according to these drawers and these categorizations anymore. Because you're no longer a living being. Not sure if it's satisfying, but
no, it's very interesting. Thank you very much. But we're in that world as the mental, the mind as opposed to the body mind, and we appear in this world as the physical.
Yeah, the body mind is what a certain state of consciousness in that world looks like. It's a configuration, a doing. It's like the whirlpool in the river. It's still only the river, but it's doing something localized. And that something localized is recognizable. You know, you can point the boundaries of the whirlpool. You can see if the whirlpool moves. Same with us. We don't really exist. Like the whirlpool doesn't really exist. You can't take the whirlpool, put it under your arm, and take it home with you, because there is no whirlpool. There is only the river. Same with us. We don't really exist, but we are a recognizable doing of what there is, right? I think, I'm on record saying I'm afraid of death because of this transition in our state of mind from something that initially was very weird when you're born, but has become what we call familiar. And then transiting out of that again, major transition. Psychedelics reduce your brain activity a little bit, and you have ego dissolution, and all that stuff happens. Imagine when your brain activity stops. So I fear the transition, but I think after the transition, it will be just, oh, of course, this is where I was all along.
But you wouldn't be, there would be no you to have the idea that this is what it was all along. You would, we
There is
presume,
a subject.
just
There is a
flow
subject.
into the lake.
There isn't a individual subject separate from the rest of what's going on, but there is a subject. When you wake up from your dream, the individual avatar separate from the rest of the mindscape of your dream is gone. There isn't a dream avatar when you wake up, but the subject is not gone. The subject behind the dream avatar is the subject behind the you who is awake. And this is important. A lot of people here, not only my talking about this, but other people talking about, the end of the dissociation, the end of individual agency. And they think that, well, their subject, their I, the thing looking out from their eyes, it is the individual subject. And therefore they actually die and they sort of dissolve in some grand ocean. And it's not really them what survives. No, no, no. It's them. It's just that they are not what they thought they were. When you are dreaming, you think you are your dream avatar. You sincerely think that. You have no doubt about that. So much so they don't even ask the question. But when you wake up and your dream avatar is dead, you realize that your dream avatar was actually you, and that it's the same consciousness looking out from the eyes of your dream avatar and looking out from your eyes right now. And you just remember what you actually are. That's what we are talking about. It's not some dissolution of the I you think you are in some ocean in which you cease to exist. No, no, your name ceases to exist. The individual agent you think you are, that illusion dissipates, like the illusion that you are your dream avatar dissipates. But nothing that ever existed stopped existing. It's the same thing looking out from your eyes right now that will experience the cognitive structure of the world as it is in itself. And there is a very good chance you will still remember what it was like being you, just like we remember what it was like being a dream avatar. And after that transition, which tends to be very difficult, I think you probably would go like, oh, yeah, of course. No big deal. I think that's what awaits us all.
Thanks, Kieran. There's a couple of follow-on questions to yours. If it's okay, I'll bring those in. Arthur, are you happy to read your follow-up to that?
Yes. Thank you, Amir, for picking up. Let me scroll to find the question. Okay, yeah, so this was also something that was triggered by reading your book, Why Myths Are Not Nonsense. It just came out in Dutch, so I read it. And in the last part, you kind of explore the idea of you call it there, the system of convictions, if it is something that is changeable. So I found this very intriguing, because if that would be the case, that would suggest that theoretically, at least, the nature of reality, the reality that we perceive on the dashboard, which is an expression of the structure of how the cognitive system represents reality at large to us, that if we can change that cognitive system, then we could see changes in the structure of perceived reality. And it would mean that basically your metaphysics becomes testable, so to speak. If you would be able to. So I read that suggestion in the third part, and I thought, wow, that would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. You know, if you're a modern day novalis, so to speak, a magical idealist.
Just to set up the foundations first, so I avoid a misunderstanding that happens a lot. I think what we call the physical world is our own stuff. It's our own construct. It's our own dashboard. A lot of it, most of it, we don't have a choice in changing because they belong in the very structure of our being as defined by evolution by natural selection over past 4 billion years. But it's our stuff. And therefore, every physical entity is relational. Just like the measurements shown in the dials of an airplane's dashboards are relative to the airplane's position and speed, location, and attitude and orientation and all that. You know, if you point the nose of the airplane in a different direction, your ground speed or your air speed may change because the wind may be going in one certain direction and not another. So yes, the physical world is relative and it's our own construct. You have your physical world, I have mine, Carolina has hers, Andrea has his. That, however, doesn't mean that there isn't a shared world. You know, the world of each airplane's dashboard is private and relative to the airplane, but there is a sky outside the airplanes, which the airplanes share. It is that real world that modulates what appears on the dashboard. It doesn't construct the dashboard, but it modulates the movements of the dials. And that we cannot change. The stimulus from the real world as it actually is outside, they are what they are. And we are dissociated from what does them. So we can't change those. So I am not a subjective idealist. I don't say that the only world that exists is the world of perception and it's private. No, I say that there is an objective world out there. I am an objective idealist. It's just that it's not physical. Essential Foundation last week published a video with 3 physicists in which all 3 of them proved mathematically in different ways that there is no such a thing as an absolute physical reality. And to me, it's like I yawn at that general conclusion because for me, it's obvious. There is no absolute physical world because nothing in a dashboard is absolute. It's proprietary, it's private. But there are absolute modulations that come from an absolute that isn't physical. The problem is that most people, when they conclude that the physical world is not absolute, because they cannot imagine anything that isn't physical, then they think that there is nothing that is absolute. No, what the experiments are showing, what the math is showing, is that there is no physical absolute, which doesn't exclude that there may be a non-physical absolute, which I think there is. Now, if we could interfere at will with our cognitive system, which I think one day we will, our morals we have to evolve, our technology we have to evolve, but one day we will, once we part with this sense of identity with this individual self, once that has become remote history, our morals will change accordingly and it will start interfering with our own cognitive systems without much concern, like ethical concern as we would have today. And we will be able to rearrange the dashboard. We may be able to install new avionics, new dials. Instead of dials, we'll install LCD screens and new control panels. And the world that we perceive will completely change because it is a dashboard and we just changed the dashboard. But even this new dashboard, what it will measure will be a stimulus from the absolute, and the absolute will not have changed. The new dashboard will look different, but it will still be modulated by what was modulating the old dashboard. Because the world we actually inhabit, this cognitive structure we are immersed in, it is still what it is, regardless of what we do in here. It's still out there. Could we one day start changing that too? There is nothing a priori that would say it's fundamentally impossible, but I think now we are talking deep future here. It's not even, we don't even have language to start speculating about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So just correct me if I'm wrong. If I get it right, you're saying that the objectivity of this physical world is constituted by the non-physical absolute plus a shared fixed cognitive system, which is more or less the same in all human beings. And because of those two factors, it constitutes the objectivity. Or I also saw the video of those three. I thought it was a brilliant video of those quantum theory. It basically undermines that the objectivity of the physical world. But let's say it like that. So do I understand it correctly? It's constituted by the non-physical absolute plus a shared cognitive system?
Yes, the non-physical absolute is the world as it is what it is. Then we have our perceptual system, which is grounded in what we call physiology. It appears as physiology. You have two eyes, not eight, like a spider. Your eyes detect the the visible spectrum and not ultraviolet, like bees. So it's built in. To change that, we'll have to change our physiology, and that's perception. But IIT tells us that there is no such a thing as pure perception. What we think of as perception is already enfolded in layers of interpretation. We never experience perception alone because perceptual states get folded in a hi-fi complex that already contain interpretative states. And those interpretation states are inherited from culture. They are given by beliefs, by what we consider plausible or completely implausible. This is a higher level cognitive system. If you're seeing something, it's not only V1 that is seeing, it goes all the way to the prefrontal cortex because it's folded into those layers of interpretation. The posterior hot area of the brain is indeed here, but this, it spans a lot of stuff, not only V1. Well, why am I saying this? Yeah. What this means is that of these three layers, the absolute, the perceptual layer, the interpretative layer, which we fold in what we call the experience of the world, we can today impact the third layer. We are doing it right now in this course. That's what we are doing. We are working on better interpretations of what we are perceiving, and they can be profound. I never thought it would happen to me. Rupert Spira predicted it was going to happen. Years ago, we were having dinner, and he said, "Your theories are going to sink in, and you will see a different world." And I thought he meant it metaphorically. It's more literal than we dare imagine. You see the world differently, even though you would describe it the same way. It still has the same colors, the same angles, the same distances, but it's qualitatively different because now you see mind in movement. So we are working on the third layer right now, and that's cultural work. We can work on the second layer. That's what I described. We could do in the future once our morals are no longer grounded in the notion of the self being an individual agent. We will find it perfectly acceptable to experiment at the level that today we say is anatomical or physiological. We already do that. I'm doing that by using these enhancement here, except that we would do that at a much deeper level. It has started already with Neuralink. But I don't think I don't think it is at all in the horizon that we can mess up with the third or the first, the primary level, the absolute itself. We are not there. You can mess up with it after you're dead, because then you are it. So it's going to happen anyway in all of our lives. But to do that in life, I don't think it's on the horizon. No. Unless somebody is a psychic with powers like the Jedi, and maybe they exist. I haven't seen it yet.
Thank you, Bernard. It's so intriguing. All kinds of things emanate from this line of thought. So, but yeah, thank you.
Graag gedaan.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Arthur. Dank u wel. Chris, we'll just have a couple more questions that people are resonating with as follow-ons for Kieran's question. Christian, you I can't find it now as well.
I don't know which one.
You had a question. I mean, you had a couple of follow-on questions, but I think the one people were summing up was the relationship between meaning and association,
Yes.
but also beings behind the dashboard.
Yes. So two questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe try roll them in somehow.
Okay. So the first one, hello Bernardo.
Hi, Christian.
The first one would be regarding those fairy folk behind the dashboard. If they are still isolated complexes, but without dissociation, how does that work together?
Oh no,
So
they
like
have to have. There has to be some level of dissociation, but it may
dissociation.
not be as strong as ours.
Yes, because else they would be mind at large. They would not be individual complexes.
Correct.
Even, but is there a possibility for them to be behind the dashboard and still dissociate?
Of course. They would be no different in nature than our dissociation. They could be different in degree. They could be less dissociated. And the only reason we talk about them being behind the dashboard is that everything is actually behind the dashboard. We too.
Yes.
It's the only
Yes.
thing that exists. The difference is that our dashboard didn't evolve to pick them out because their actions may not have a significant bearing on our ability to survive and reproduce. And if it doesn't, then they are of a nature that we wouldn't have evolved to pick out because it doesn't do anything for us.
So you have to have at least a minimal degree of dissociation so you can
to be an individuated agent, you would have to have some degree of dissociation. Ours is extreme. We have an extreme degree of dissociation. Look, evolutionarily, it's not always the case that it's always better to be as dissociated as possible. For instance, we can't see around corners. Maybe if we were less dissociated, we could. But if you are too dissociated, it's always also bad because if you panic because a tiger is roaming the forests of Siberia while you are in the Netherlands or in Germany, well, that you're not going to live very long because you will be in a constant state of stress and panic about things that don't have a bearing on your survival. Now, where do you find that optimal? Well, it depends on how you're put together, what you need to survive, what are your weak points, where are you fragile in, and where are you strong at. All of these things will determine what the optimal sweet spot is for how much or how little dissociated you are. On the extreme, if you're very little dissociated, you don't identify with your body anymore. You know you're not it, so you don't give a damn about it. You're not going to live very long, all right? So our ancestors were not those. They were the ones that really identified with their bodies. Now, it is entirely conceivable that in this world, this is not another world. It's another world. It seems to be another world because it doesn't show up on our dashboard. And we think that our dashboard is the world. Now, okay, that's why we talk about another world. No, it's this world. It's right here. It's around us. If they are of a nature sufficiently different from ours, it stands to reason that the sweet spot of this balance between dissociation and not being dissociated, for them is different. For them, the sweet spot is less dissociation. There is still dissociation, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about entities here. There would be no individuated agency. It would be just the ocean of mind at large. So there is some degree, but it could be a lot less because we are extraordinarily dissociated. I personally am incredibly dissociated. It's very difficult to move my baseline consciousness from my girlfriend and my partner. It's much easier to do that. She's an artist. Karen knows her. She would be a natural fairy seer if she lived in Ireland. But we are here in the part of the world. I assume you are in Northern Rhine-Westphalia as well, somewhere around.
No, I'm in Romania,
Oh,
far
you're
away
in
from here.
Romania. You have such a German name.
I am German. I'm German, but I'm living in Romania,
Okay.
so far away. But
So in this three-country area where I am right now, if you look at the photo of the world at night, the brightest spot is where I am. Ferries have disbanded from here. They have run away from here a long time ago because there is too much going on in here. But yeah. So I'm not talking about another world, and I'm not talking about non-dissociated entities. I'm talking about this world and dissociated entities that are just not so extremely dissociated as we are.
As we are. Yeah, so dissociation is the only mechanism for individual complexes to form in mind at large. There is nothing else than dissociation.
Well, I would phrase it differently. When we talk about individual entities forming in a space of consciousness, the name we give for that is dissociation.
Yeah.
Dissociation is the name we give to that process. So it's not like dissociation is the only mechanism. No, dissociation is the name we give to it.
Yeah. Maybe the one we know, the one we know. So that would also mean that there is an evolutionary advantage if there are people which have this kind of skills, like seeing the fairy folk. That would mean that there is also an evolutionary advantage in this world for having these skills.
Well, look, it's very easy to imagine situations in which there's advantages, but you also have to imagine the consequences of having that skill under other situations. If you can see around corners, or if you can read people's minds, imagine how functional you would be in the middle of an agitated crowd. You'd die very quickly. Because you'd be overwhelmed with stimuli that you can't react promptly on. So every advantage comes with a disadvantage. And for us, the balance has been extreme dissociation. So we survive in the midst of an agitated crowd running away because we are not picking up the agitation of other people. We have this dashboard that gives us an overview of what's going on, doesn't overload our emotional centers, may overload a bit, but not anywhere near what it would do if we were transparent to within a 100-meter range. We would be very dysfunctional. But maybe the corners of nature's degrees of freedom, where other agencies find their being, play by slightly different rules in which the optimal trade-off is different. Maybe for them, it is useful to have a kind of crowd mind, like ants and termites seem to do, even in this very world. The way they organize themselves, the way they evolved to organize themselves, seem to benefit this kind of less dissociated crowd thinking structure that they seem to have. For us, bipedal monkeys, that was not the sweet spot. Maybe it could have been if we had evolved in the direction those insects have evolved. Or maybe it could have been if we perceived and inhabited a different corner of the actual world than we do. And maybe what we call mythologically the fairy folk are sitting in a different corner of this cognitive structure. Spatially, it's here because there is no space. But a different cognitive region in which it is more advantageous to be less dissociated. It is more advantageous, for instance, for communication. I wrote it in my UAP essay, one of my 2 UAP essays on the debrief. For us, we are entirely dependent on language. In other words, funny noises to take the contents of our minds and move it to somebody else's mind. And a lot gets lost in translation. It's a very narrow and noisy channel. We can't convey nuance, we can't convey subtlety, we can't convey, it takes a Shakespeare uh, to do those kinds of things. It takes a skill and sensitivity that only the greatest poets have. It takes a Schiller to do this. Um, Maybe for them it's very different, because if they are less dissociated, they could implant a very meaning, not the conveyor of meaning, but the meaning directly in the cognitive system of another entity. And that would have the advantage that you would have no cultural barriers, no language barriers, there would be no misunderstanding, um, communication be direct. And it could be interspecies as well, because even if we don't share a conceptual dictionary and a certain logic, if you can implant a meaning directly, then the receiver will use his or her own conceptual dictionary to dress it up with the symbolisms that are evocative to them. You don't need to share those, because you don't need them
Universal
to
language,
yeah. So
like a
they will
universal
understand
language
it in their language, while you understand it in your
in
language.
your
But if
language.
it's the meaning that is directly conveyed, then they will dress it up in language and symbolism. You don't have to have their conceptual dictionary, their symbolic dictionary to do that. And that's what they seem to be able to do to us too.
Yeah. Like psychedelics are also promoting somehow this weakening of the dissociation. It has something to do also with empathy, because I guess empathy, feeling what another being is feeling, is also some kind of weakening of the dissociation.
Yes.
So psychedelics with this expansion of consciousness and weakening of the dissociation seem to promote this also.
Yes, I think I just said we are extremely dissociated, and we are. And I think we are physiologically extremely dissociated as well. But what we experience as a dissociation is it's even amplified by our belief systems. Materialist beliefs reinforce the dissociation because it removes the plausibility of certain things we experience, we feel, being valid. We filter them out culturally because of our belief system. In other words, we actually may be less dissociated than we think we are. We may have a natural level of empathy that we discard because we believe that it isn't possible, or we believe we make this stuff up ourselves, and therefore, for all we know, it doesn't correspond to reality anyway, so we don't need to give it any attention. By removing the plausibility of picking up things directly from across the dissociative boundary, including how other creatures are feeling, we reinforce the dissociation at the third level, at the cultural level. Um, um, in other words, it goes beyond what nature already enforced at the physiological level. And psychedelics, because they make very clear the arbitrary nature of our beliefs, they make it more, they make it easier for us to take certain inputs seriously, and to act upon them as opposed to dismissing them. Psychedelics is acid for belief systems. They give you a sort of a backstage view into the storytelling in your mind, and you realize you're making the whole shit up. It's you making it up. And that kind of experience takes out some of the culturally imposed filters. Um, Psychedelics with analytic idealism over the years can increase our levels of empathy to a point where it's almost dysfunctional, and then you have to relearn how to deal with it. I had to relearn, or to learn for the first time in my adulthood, how to deal with empathy. I didn't have the tools. I didn't grow up to learn how to deal with empathy. I didn't have the emotional maturity, so I was disorientated for a while,
Yeah.
which Rupert Spira also predicted. And when he said that, I was like, yeah. And then lo and
And
behold,
what's Rupert's solution to that? The weight of the world, basically. That would be, how do you solve that? No solution for now.
at some point, you have to think the following. Yes, you need empathy to preserve your humanity. If you get rid of empathy, you lose your humanity. But you have to ask yourself, to what degree is it functional to not resist the stream of empathy? Because there comes a point where it makes it more difficult for you to have a positive impact in the world. In other
Yes.
words, it helps no one that you just open the floodgates to empathy. You would just curl up in a fetal position in a corner and cry your way to death. Who gets helped by that? Nobody. Nobody gets helped by that. So you gradually learn to take certain things and put them in a room in the palace of mind, and you visit that room regularly, because otherwise you lose contact with your humanity, and then you're really dead, even when your heart is still beating. And now you're dead. You're dead in the deadest way imaginable. So you have to visit that room, but you cannot live in that room alone.
You get nuts. You go nuts if you
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
I know what you thought.
It's a very hard balance to find. And it's not even a fixed balance. To me, it's an evolving balance. I'm visiting that room now this year less
Yeah.
because
The impact is greater every time
it's
you go there.
greater, and I see what's coming down the pike in the next few years. And it
Yeah.
helps no one if I become dysfunctional, just by looking, just by looking at that. It doesn't help anybody. So I visit it less at the end, the
Yep.
second half of this year. I visit it less. Maybe in 2030, I'll visit it a lot more. Maybe in 2035, maybe next year.
Yeah.
I don't know. But you have to visit it. You feel it. You feel a kind of, it has the quality of concrete and deadness. When you don't visit that room long enough, you start experience yourself. I'll drop some words. I don't mean them literally, but just to give you an idea, mechanistic.
That means to be human. That means to be human. It's that this what makes you human,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah. It's very important to defend our humanity because it's the only thing that links us.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Can we bring in a very related question? Is that cool, Christian?
Yeah, sure,
Yep.
sure.
It's from Mia or Maya. I don't know if you're here. You have a question on letting nature work through me. But you've also put something in the chat. If you don't unmute and ask yourself, I'll get Fawn to read it. Is that cool with you, Fawn? I'll just put it in the chat again.
Yeah, I've got it right here. Okay, so this is from Mia. Since childhood, I've had a strong sense of nature wanting to work through me in ways that are not of westernized common interest. I have forced myself to do many menial jobs to survive and have been miserable while doing so. My question is how to find where to aim my energies. How can I listen to the daimon and to find the sweet spot and finally let nature come through? I feel it is certainly something around philosophical trajectory, writing and helping other life forms. But I find if I start to do those trajectories more, my ability to survive and take care of my kids is even more difficult than with the meaningless jobs. Thank you for any insight here.
I wrote a book about it that is coming out in August next year. It's called The Daimon and the Soul of the West. It's not a how-to book. I'm not a recipes guy. I'm not in the business of telling people what to do and how to live. I find it preposterous. I look in the mirror and I would feel ashamed if I tried to do that. Who am I to tell people how to live and what to do? But I wrote about my own experience with this very question. Look, we are all parts of nature. We grew out of nature. Nature made us. We didn't parachute here from a different universe. We arose out of it just like the apple blossoms arise out of the apple tree every spring. Although we have a individuated sense of self, we are not fundamentally distinct from the rest of nature. Just like the apple blossom, even though it's discernible as an apple blossom, it's not fundamentally distinct from the apple tree. It's a part of the apple tree. It's something the apple tree does in order for it to have new apple trees in the future. Otherwise, that's the end of the line for apple trees. A flower, a blossom is the reproductive organ of a tree, of a plant. It is crucial that we remain metacognitively aware of this reality. It is crucial that we don't think of ourselves as something different from the rest of the world, because that's the route to nihilism. If you see yourself as fundamentally different, distinct from the rest of nature, look at the consequences. Number one, you are not at home. Number two, you're an alien. You're weird. You don't belong in here. You're a fluke. Number three, you're going to die and the world is not. So if you are you and not the world, ultimately it's all for nothing. You are doomed to irrelevance, nothingness, complete nihilism, total lack of meaning. And that's the route we are in. Even our self-help industry, even our well-being industry tells us you have to take the reins of your life and make your future and make your dreams come true as if it were all about you. It's important that we recognize the obvious fact that it has never been about us. It's not about us, and it will never be about us. It's as preposterous to think that it is as it is for the apple blossom to think it's about it and not the apple tree and the other apple trees. Because then the apple blossom would say, my goal in life is to never shrink, never fade away, and to hell with the apple tree. I mean, that's a very neurotic apple blossom, very deluded, very disconnected from what's actually going on. And if you're disconnected from what's actually going on, you can't serve nature. You are a tool that refuses to recognize what you're made for. And you try to go your own route, and there's nothing there. It's a desert. And at the same time, if the tool doesn't self-maintain and take care of itself, then it's useless too. If you have no resources to act in the world and upon the world, then you serve no purpose. So priority number one, make sure that you have the means to act in the world, and that may be interpreted by others as being egocentric to some extent. In other words, you need to have food on your plate. You need to have a roof over your head. You need to have some money in the bank that you can survive and do something. Because if you have none of this, you will be so absorbed in figuring out how you survive into the next day that you will not be able to serve the purpose of the apple blossom. You'll not be able to engage meaningfully in the world as nature is trying to do with you. So the menial jobs are part of the game. If you want to be a useful apple blossom, the apple blossom has to maintain itself, and sometimes it takes menial jobs. And what I'm trying to say is that it's not a binary here. It's not either menial jobs or following the daimon. No, the daimon doesn't, the daimon is instinctive. It's not in the business of trying to maintain you and thinking about your safety and your well-being and the means you have to act in the world. No, the daimon is nature. It's like a hurricane, a tsunami, a volcano. It does its thing. You are a special tool because you can think of self-maintenance. You can think of what you need to do in order to be a better tool, and that may involve menial jobs. I hate doing administration. I'm now the head of two organizations, a for-profit AI company and a non-profit foundation, philosophical think tank. I hate doing administrative work. And there are people who help me, but there is stuff I have to do. They are very menial. I absolutely despise it. But it's part of the job of being an effective tool that you do those things too. If you can get rid of them in a way that is functional and effective, then by all means. But until you find that way, you have to do the menial stuff. And if the menial stuff means that you have to do certain tasks that are perceived as menial, then those are important too. Look, if nobody collected my trash, I and all my neighbors would be in trouble. And my ability to, do something in and for the world that follows the collective psyche, that follows, the actual goals of the tree and not of the apple blossom, we would have a problem. So many of the things we call menial are pretty damn important. Somebody's got to do them. So one should not torture oneself. I don't torture myself when I'm doing administration, signing papers, looking at numbers. I think the trash collector should not torture themselves because these are all parts of the job that needs to be done. Now, the art of the situation here, and I'm still learning it. It took me 50 years to get to where I am, and I'm still learning it. The art is to know where the balance lies. The art is to know how to be self-focused enough that the tool is effective, but also to completely let go of self-focus when that's what needs to happen for the benefit of the totality. And it's bloody difficult because the ego always hijacks the higher purposes and says, oh, but to achieve this higher purpose, I need to be rich and famous because that's how I reach people and that's how I have the means. So first I need to be rich and famous and then I'll talk to the daimon. Okay. Yeah, imagine if everybody would think like this. So that's the ego hijacking the whole daimon concept, the whole concept that our lives are not about us. They have never been and will never be. It's about something that goes way beyond us. How do you find that? How do you know what is the true voice of the daimon and what is the fake voice of the daimon that the wish-fulfilling ego is always using and speaking to you? I wish I had the 7 steps to figuring out the difference. I don't. What I can tell you is that you get knocked about by life enough that if you have been paying attention, at some point you have kissed the ground enough, been bruised enough, been shaken enough, if you've been paying attention, that you see it, that it becomes clearer. And I don't know how to translate that. And then even if I knew, probably it wouldn't be useful because it's different for every person. Every person is unique. But at some point, you life kicks you enough that you've been diligent in paying attention, you figure it out. And today, I am at a surprisingly comfortable spot. I'm far from telling you that I have 100% accuracy, but I am surprisingly comfortable today. I am not fooled easily anymore by wish fulfillment, self-deception. The voice of the daimon is like a smell. It's difficult to describe. It's furtive, but it's unmistakably there at the same time. I wrote about it. Wait until next year when it comes out. But I don't have a surefire recipe. All I can tell you is that it's not binary. Sometimes the menial is the daimon, is the daimonic, and sometimes not. Sometimes what is daimonic, it completely neglects the individual self. And how do you navigate that? Well, pay attention, and eventually you start discerning that. Once you start discerning it, it gets faster, because now you how do I explain this? Like if you've never seen, if you're born blind, it's very difficult to discern even what a color means, right? But if you can see black and white, oh, now when you see red for the first time, you know it's a color. Now, so once you, for the first time, start discerning and some whispers of what is daimonic and what's not, even though you can't discern most of it yet, it gets much faster because now you know what it is. You've seen the color for the first time. You've seen the daimonic for the first time. You know what kind of qualities it has. What are the parameters? What are the scales? And then you start learning a lot faster. And you probably need to suffer less to learn faster after that point. But most of us don't even give us the chance to pay attention because we think it's all about us. The whole well-being industry, your doctor is saying it's all about you. Your therapist is saying it's all about you. The self-help guru is saying it's all about you. The books are saying it's all about you. Then it's about your life. You have to take control. Yeah. I mean, poor us. We're screwed. We're royally screwed right now in the West. It will change. It will take a while.
Great question. Great answer. Thank you so much. I'm just wanting to do one follow-on. Maybe John, do you want to do that follow-on you just wrote?
Yeah, sure. It's really short. I just wanted to know if you could give a recent example of your daimon speaking to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
No, let me look for another one, otherwise it will get political. Starting Essential Foundation and leaving my career of over 20 years in high tech. That was daimonic. I resisted it for 5 years until life brought me down to below my knees to the point of seriously considering suicide twice, to open me up to what is daimonic. But that daimonic impulse, now I look back and I recognize it was there all along. And to see it, you have to understand that your life is not about you, because for as long as I would believe that my life is about me, I would have stayed where I was, because I was earning mighty well. I had status, I had nothing to prove. Everybody knew me in the industry. I knew everybody. I was extremely comfortable. And I left all that to start anew in the nonprofit sector that I knew nothing about. To have my finances are in a I'm not in a bad shape, but I don't have bonuses. I don't have shares. I have a salary, like most of us do. But I was in a place where my salary was a small part of my compensation. That was daimonic. It required parting with the need to have personal status, the need to be respected, the need to have power, they need to have influence. That was daimonic. There have been so many daimonic things in my life. Every book I wrote is daimonic. I don't like to write. I never liked to write. Every book is a birth, and it's painful. I never saw myself as a philosopher. I always saw myself as an engineer and scientist at best, but certainly not a philosopher. This whole philosophy thing is imposed on me. Just sort of, it's like an anvil that fell over on my head, and I have to do something with that anvil because that's what nature is trying to do through me, and it's not about me. So I do it, and today I do it with a fair degree of peace. But my first 4 books, I wrote them because I wanted to get rid of them. Every book I wrote, at least until book number 4, arguably until later, I thought, okay, now this is it. This is my final book. Now I'm done with this thing. I can go back being what I want to be as an engineer. It's daimonic. I wouldn't be able to sleep. I would wake up at 3 in the morning with an idea and come up here and write it, because it would make me literally sick. It would grab my mind and torture me with anxiety, unexplainable anxiety, delusional anxiety. That was daimonic. Being with my partner today is daimonic. The person I used to be would not have a relationship with an artist, somebody who is intuitive, somebody who is open to the world, was never caught in that trap of status, power, career growth. Those were the that was the language I spoke, and that was my world. That was my value system. So my relationship is daimonic. Um, if I pull on this thread, there will be nothing left at the end. Today, almost everything is daimonic. The AI company I founded this year is daimonic. At the end of last year, I had a plan for this year. There was there was no sign of starting a company. This whole thing just happened, like super quick, out of nowhere. It's like, what? How am I here now today? How did this happen? I never saw this coming. I didn't plan for it. You learn to not suffer when life imposes these things on you. And I'm in peace now. So now I am in a position at the end of 2024 that I would never have imagined at the end of 2023. The only thing that was part of my plan at the end of 2023 was the Daimons book, which I finished writing this year. That I did. Everything else was not at all what I planned. The direction of my life is again different. The diamond doesn't follow one direction. It weaves around. It ticks the marks. It goes around buoys. Depending on circumstances, it optimizes and as it goes. And once you truly understand with your body, not only here, that your life is not about you, it's much easier to deal with it because it's not about you. So what's the problem that it's going in a direction you never anticipated? It's not about you. You're in for the ride, and your job is to be a good tool, not to determine the direction. Now, think of it the following way. You don't choose where you're going. You're driving a car. You don't choose your destination, but you are entrusted with driving safely to the destination. And it's a destination you've never been to. So the trip is a discovery journey. And now I just translated Dutch. Ontdekkingsreis. It sounds very nice in Dutch, but doesn't sound very good in English. A discovery journey. But that's what it is. So the attitude that helps is an attitude of openness. I'm curious about where I'm going. I didn't choose the direction. I didn't choose the destination. I've never been there. I don't know what I will find when I am there, but I am entrusted with driving the car because the thing that chose the destination can't drive a car. It's my job. It's my role. I don't choose the destination. It's not about me, so I don't choose the destination. The journey is not about me, but I'm the only one who can drive there. So I will be open-minded. I will recognize my role. I'll drive to that destination with curiosity because I've never seen this environment before. So I drive with curiosity. And if the guy or the entity or the girl who chooses the destination tells me, well, it changed my mind, now you have to turn right over here, then okay, I turn right over there. And I will be curious about what I will find after I turn right over there. This brings a very bearable lightness of being. Life becomes lighter, less heavy, because you no longer carry the burden of the responsibility for choosing where to go. And that's the biggest burden of responsibility we have. That's also the greatest source of guilt and self-deprecation, because we think we chose wrongly in the past, and that's why we're in the crap we are today. That's why we landed here in this shit. We should have chosen better. It was our responsibility. Well, that goes away too. All of that regret and the weight of the responsibility for having to choose properly, which is impossible. There are gazillions of variables that have a direct bearing on your success or failure that we have absolutely no way to influence, let alone to control. So there is a lightness of being a very bearable one that comes with surrendering the responsibility for choosing the destination and focusing on the responsibility for driving the car well. But before you get to that lightness, there is a lot of anxiety related to recognizing that not only you lost control, you never had control to begin with. And that transition from experiencing the anxiety of not being in control to the lightness of, oh, I'm not in control. That transition it was painful for me. Maybe for other people it's easier. I don't know. For me, it was very painful. It took years. But I'm in a very fine place right now. I even forgot what was the original question. I hope I answered you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. And I can't
Thanks.
wait for the book also.
Yeah, maybe we can do a whole series just dedicated to that topic when the book comes out.
August next year.
Yeah. Okay, so trigger warning. We're gonna, well, often what I plan for us to do isn't what we end up doing. So I don't know if that's daimonic or just poor planning. But trigger warning, we will go into politics and death for the last hour. Starting with politics, Raghavan. It is a follow-on from the same topic. You had a question on Trump and Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, I think he kind of partly answered it, but still, if there's somehow, if you can drill down, it's like, how if nature is trying to work through something, work through Trump or Hitler or any of the bad situation that ever happened or is happening. And I mean, you just said if one of the blossoms, if it, chooses to go in a bad way, but still it is an action of mind at large or the universal consciousness. But again, one of the answers that Robert just gave in the chat, it's like he said that maybe nature is trying to learn that as well, like the badness of things as well through experiences, something like that. But yeah, if you have any specific answer to it, yeah, I would love to hear it.
We always like to think of nature as ultimately doing the right thing, even if it appears to be the bad thing, right? That's what you try to do right there in the way you formulated your question. I'm not romantic in this regard. I see nature doing horrible things. I see nature creating animals that can only survive if they kill hundreds of other animals in gruesome ways in the course of their lives. Predators do that. Do you know how long it takes a lion to actually kill its prey? They are already eating the prey for a while before the prey actually dies, or even goes unconscious, especially when it's big prey. I see nature as the tornado that can cut across a field harmlessly or can cut across town and kill people. It is an energy that is moving, has its own impetus, but it's not a metacognitive energy that thinks things through. It's not deliberating. It doesn't have means to pass appropriate moral judgment. It's instinctive, spontaneous, just like a tornado or a hurricane or a tsunami. You don't get angry at the tornado because it destroyed your house. It's a force of nature. You know that. You don't get angry. You don't get angry at the lion because it took 6 hours to kill the elephant it brought down while eating the elephant alive and conscious. It's the lion. It's nature, right? Now, nature did produce some apple blossoms that can pass moral judgment because they have evolved higher level mental functions like us. And what that means is that we have the moral responsibility. We are the part of nature that can pass moral judgment. So the buck stops with us. The daimonic energies are incredibly strong. They can end the world. And when people are channeling daimonic energies, when they mobilize large parts of society. Hitler did that. Trump is doing that. They are not doing, they didn't do it or are doing it thinkingly. It's not like they figured out how to tap into the daimonic. Uh, it's not that they have the daimon has them. They are under control, and we're under control. But that daimonic force is morally ambiguous, just like a tornado is morally ambiguous. It is trying to do something. It doesn't quite know what. It's like playing the game of getting warmer and getting colder. You know when you're going in the right direction, but you may make mistakes and you don't quite understand what is it that you're trying to do. And because of that, the daimonic forces are morally very ambiguous. They can even have noble purposes at root, for instance. And that's where the comparison gets uncanny, because it's the same thing happening again, and that's what scares me. The German people in 1928 gave the Nazi party 1% of the vote. In 1932, they gave them 38% of the vote. What happened? Well, it's the Great Depression of 1929. And also the Treaty of Versailles. The German people didn't have high self-esteem. They had been humiliated for 20 years after the end of, 15 years. After the end of the First World War. They were suffering from high inflation. They were poor. And the energy that was mobilized, the daimonic energy that was mobilized by Hitler at first was the energy of dignity, of self-respect, of a decent life, where people had enough to eat, where people had safety. The energy of make Germany great again. That was the energy of 1932. And Hitler rode that energy. That energy was channeled through him. Hitler was never in control of anything. He failed school. He fancied himself an artist, a painter, but he was rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Arts. Because although he was technically competent, he was creatively mediocre. He finally found self-esteem in the army in the First World War, where he got one of the highest decorations the German army could give to anyone, and the non-commissioned officers. He was a non-commissioned officer, an NCO. He got that condecoration, even though it was almost always given only to actual officers. So he got caught in that, and when the war ended, he was completely lost. He lost his self-esteem again, because he never had control over anything. He was always caught in the energy of the moment. So he stayed in the orbit of the army after the war ended, because one of his commanding officers described him as a very tired street dog that was desperately looking for a new, in Dutch you would say the boss, a new boss, the dog's owner, the pack leader. So disorientated he was. So, and this army officer hired him as an intelligence officer after the First World War in the 1920s now. And his job was to spy on a new extreme right-wing political party that had been founded by former railway employees. And they had an anti-Semitic, very populist platform, and the army was worried about them. So they asked Hitler to spy on them, to attend their meetings. And it was because of that Hitler became a Nazi, because he sympathized with what was being said in those meetings, even though he was supposed to be a spy there to combat them. And in one of those meetings he was spying on, he got so moved he decided to speak. And the words just came through him. And he was incredibly compelling because it was daimonic. That energy of make Germany great again and let's restore our dignity. We are a humiliated nation. We are being humiliated left and right. We are in a deep economic crisis. We are suffering from inflation. The powers that be are humiliating us. The French would enter Germany from the west just before the winter and take all the coal back to France. So the Germans didn't have coal to warm themselves up in the winter. This was after the war already. You know, the loser is treated like not even the lowest level employee, and it's treated like a door carpet. That was the energy he channeled in that speech, and he impressed the leader of that party so much that he eventually became the leader. And the name of the party was changed to the National Socialist Party, Workers' Party, or National Socialist Work Party, Arbeiters. Well, I forgot. He was not even in agreement with that name. He wanted the Nationalist Revolutionary Party. He didn't want socialism in there. But he was not the big boss yet at the time. So it became the National Socialist Party, the Nazi party. That's how it happened. He was never in control. He never chose anything. It happened to him. He was caught by the daimon. And that energy, you could construe that energy as a positive one. It's the energy of dignity, the energy of self-respect, the energy of a productive, decent life, none of which they had. But Hitler, as the tool of the daimon, carried the moral responsibility for passing moral judgment in order to channel that energy in a way that is morally appropriate. Because he was the part of nature that had that responsibility. You know, the energy itself is morally ambiguous and instinctive. It was him who was caught by the daimon, who had that responsibility, and he failed that responsibility. He made it about himself. He started conflating Germania, the great Germany, the empire of 1,000 years. He started conflating that with him as an individual. That's how the devil enters the world, is when the morally neutral but unfathomable energy of the daimonic gets channeled by corrupt moral judgment that conflates it with personhood, individual agency. That's how the dictator mistakes the well-being of the country for his well-being. That's what makes Putin wage war against the Slavic peoples in order to save the Slavic peoples. That's how the devil enters the world.
I mean, if I make
it happening again.
I mean, if I make a small analogy, is it like saying that you not choosing to start this nonprofit organization and just working in high tech the same as what Hitler did? I mean, like in
No.
the sense that you are going against what was the daimon wanting to work through you.
Hitler didn't go against the daimon. I was going against the daimon. Hitler wasn't. Hitler didn't even have the maturity to know what he was doing. Just as Trump doesn't have the maturity to know what's happening through him. He thinks it's about him. That's when you're most vulnerable to fail the task of having moral oversight of what's happening through you. That's your only job, is to have moral oversight of what's happening through you. But when you do not have the maturity as a human being to even know these things, that's how it goes wrong. So Hitler didn't go against the daimon. Hitler mistook the daimon for him. And in doing that, he mischanneled the unfathomable energy of the daimon. He sent the tornado in the wrong direction. And how do we know that? Well, because the end result was precisely the opposite of the original energy. The end result was the complete destruction of energy, of Germany. The utter humiliation of the German peoples, the rape of the entire female population of Berlin and East Germany, the destruction of the entire wealth of Germany, the destruction of Germany as a name, the honor of the name and the flag of Germany has only been restored in the last 30 years. Germans wouldn't be patriotic for decades after the Second World War because they themselves thought of it, and it's absurd, but they thought it was immoral to be a German patriot, to sing the anthem by the flag. It happened only at sporting events. It was bad taste, to be very patriotic. In other words, the end result was the opposite of the original energy. Let's make Germany great again. Dignity, self-respect, a good life, a productive life, great things. The end result was the opposite. And that happens when you embody and you channel the energy, the daimonic energies, but without proper moral oversight. So you steer it in the wrong direction. And then catastrophe happens. This has been repeated in history again and again and again. Alexander, the original energy, defended the Greek culture against the Persian invaders. Where did it end up? The corruption and conquest of the rest of the world and the burning down of Persepolis. One of the greatest cultural catastrophes in the history of humanity. It is important that we recognize that the energies in movement in Europe, but mainly in the US right now, are legitimate energies. It's impossible. It's important that we recognize that liberal elites have slowly over the decades stolen the less educated half of the population of their dignity and self-respect by peddling this message that you're only worthwhile if you have a college degree, and now we will give you all the means to have that, but that's the measure of self-worth. And therefore, that energy of a restoration of dignity, a restoration of self-respect, a restoration of worth, that's the energy movement. It's an energy that tries to combat the very subtle but effective ways in which mainstream media has always manipulated us since the end of the Second World War. We learned that from the Germans. Germans invented large-scale propaganda, and of course the winning powers learned from them how to do that. And we have been using it for two reasons for decades. One reason is to sell you something, it's called marketing. And the other way is to win elections. That's campaigning, political PR. We learned that from the Germans. They invented it. And why did it happen so late? Well, because we needed radio for these things to be possible. And it was invented just before the Second World War, Marconi in the 1920s. So it happened that it was the Germans who invented it, and we learned very well. And now that we are realizing that these tools have been used on us, not in an extremely malicious way, but to get elected, to have power, and to sell you stuff. We don't want to be deceived. So that energy rises again. I don't want to be deceived. I want to have self-respect. I want to have dignity. My dignity is being violated again. My sense of self-worth is being violated by how I am portrayed in the cultural narratives and by how I'm being manipulated by the media. These are all legitimate grievances, legitimate energies that even though morally neutral, could even be construed as being morally positive. Who would say that it's not a good thing for all of us together to have self-respect, to have dignity, and not to be cheated and deceived? Who would argue against that? But once the energies are in movement, they carry an inertia, power, that makes the individuals who particularly channel them very, very powerful. And if they are not very, very metacognitive and not very mature and not very morally strong, they are liable to channeling it in an extraordinarily destructive direction. It happens to dictators, has always happened, and it's happening again. Now we just cross our fingers and pray every night that we learned something over the past 3 generations, and we will not allow it to go as bad this time as it has gone previous times. But we are in a moment of extraordinary danger. Let me put it this way. It has never in the entire history of humanity been so dangerous as now until the end of this decade. Because we never had as powerful and as many weapons in such a depolarized, decentralized world order as we are now. There are lots of players now. In the Cold War, there were 2. Now there are lots of players, all of them armed with a quantity and a power of weaponry that didn't exist before, with a degree of communication, of 24 hours immediate news, immediate communication through social media, in which every voice is empowered now, in which moderation, editorial control, that's what we used to have in the 80s. And the news media would manipulate us, but there was some degree of morally centered editorial control. Now there is none. Social media makes every moral voice as loud as every moral one. It has never been this dangerous in the history of these monkeys walking around this rock. We'll see. We'll see how this will.
But on some level, it also goes in the direction that whatever nature is trying to work through humans, before it gains this momentum, before it gains this momentum, it is on some level morally right. Whatever it's working through humans, at least.
Look, from the point of view of nature, whatever nature is doing, it's doing it to itself. From that perspective, it's always morally good because it's not putting anybody else through suffering. It's doing it to itself.
Yeah.
And that's the root of nature's moral neutrality. Whatever it's doing it to itself. It's only we that have the perspective of these individuated agents. So we carry the moral responsibility. So the conclusion I extract from this realization is not that, well, it's then okay to bomb the Ukrainians, right? Because it's nature doing it to itself. No, that's not the conclusion I take from this. The conclusion I take is the following. Only I, as a dissociated, and you, and everybody, as dissociated authors of nature, only we both, number one, have the higher level mental capacity to pass appropriate value judgments. And 2, only we really know what it is like to be an individuated agent who suffers. So it is up to us to recognize and then voice and implement the truth, the reality that only we can discern, that it is not okay to bomb civilians during a geopolitical conflict invented by the mystical hallucinations of a dictator. It is not okay. And to say that it's not okay does not mean that it's written in some stone tablet somewhere written by the finger of God himself that it's not okay. No, it's not okay because it's our role to pass value judgment. It is our responsibility to say that it's not okay because we are the only products of nature that can pass that value judgment. So nature counts on us to prevent it from doing harm to itself when it's not necessary. It's our responsibility. We cannot evade it by recognizing that, okay, there are no stone tablets. Therefore, we can bomb the Ukrainians. No, it's ours. The moral buck stops here. And either we live up to this responsibility, or we will inflict tremendous suffering on ourselves, as we have done for the past 6,000 years of recorded history, and probably for a lot longer in non-recorded history. We'll see how this will unfold.
Oh, thank you. That was really great. Thank you.
Thanks, Radifan. Thank you. So I thought we could just pivot back to a question many people brought up earlier, based on a small comment you made about death, Bernardo, but it was also one of the more voted questions on the Nolt board, submitted by, apologies again if I mispronounce this, Panagiotis, who I don't currently see in the people who are online. So if you're online and you want to read that question, just unmute at any point, or if you want to follow it up, just unmute and do so. Otherwise, if you're available and you okay to read it for me, in case you missed it earlier, I'm just recovering from a bit of an illness, which just makes my voice get a bit tired quickly. So Fawn's helping me out. Thank you, Fawn.
Yeah, of course. All right. Whew, this is a long one, but a good one. So if we suppose that death corresponds with the dissolution of our localized alter's boundary, we are thus reunited with mind at large in an instant once we die. Do you think that there is some qualitative character to the experience after death? Part 2. If not, the reunification with mind at large is not unlike the absolute darkness after death that materialism suggests. That is because I think for there to be something it is like to be in a state, there has to be a localized point of view or a boundary through which one observes and interacts. Part 3. If there is some qualitative aspect, then it must be the case that immediately after death, another alter is instantiated. The valence of the experience this alter might have might range from very bad to very good. And finally, part 4, is it worrying that the experience after death might be a very bad one? Does it make sense to worry about this since our own localized perspective will no longer be valid? How do you contrast this with Rupert Spire's idea that the reunification is inherently a positive experience, in parentheses, reacquaintance, etc.?
I dispute the premise of part 2. I do not think there needs to be a dissociated or a localized point of view for there to be what it is like to be. I think there can be qualitative experience, and every experience is qualitative. What defines experience is the quality of it. I do not think that there needs to be dissociation for there to be qualities, for there to be something it is like to be in a certain state. In the beginning, before life emerged in the universe, there were no dissociative alters. There was no life. There was only the mind of nature. There was only mind at large. There was only the universal consciousness. And I think there was something it was like to be it. We can all visualize that by going into an ideal, a perfect, in our minds, it's a thought experiment. You go into an ideal sensory deprivation chamber in which you cannot see anything, you cannot hear, you cannot feel anything in your skin, you don't taste, and you don't smell anything. You're just floating in salt water, so you don't even feel that anything is touching you, in perfect silent darkness. There will still be something it is like to be you, even though there is no world beyond your dissociative boundary because perception has been just turned off. So you do not need to have a dissociative boundary in order to perceive an outside world for there to be something it is like to be you. Your experience can be entirely endogenous. You can have thoughts and feelings that do not require any dissociative boundary. These are qualities of experience, thoughts and feelings that emerge endogenously from within you and do not require any boundary of any sort. So I dispute the premise of part 2. I don't dispute, but I don't make it my own, the assertion attributed to Rupert that there is something inherently positive about being the mind of nature, being mind at large. I think what may be described as positive by people who have achieved some altered state of consciousness that is similar to that, in which they lose the ego, they go through ego dissolution, so they are in this oceanic state of consciousness, and they come back and they describe it as very positive. I think what's happening there is that the inherent difficulty of being a tiny creature facing a monstrous world, the inherent anxiety, the inherent concern, the inherent suffering, the inherent intimidation that comes with that goes away. So it's not like the experience of being non-dissociated is inherently positive, is that the contrast between that neutral experience and the anxieties inherent to being a thinking human being, knowing that it will die, that contrast is positive. You know, you're coming from deep shit into neutrality, so you think neutrality is inherently positive. It's very difficult to be a human being. It's more difficult than to be any animal, because animals live forever. Only we don't. If you catch my drift here, if you don't know that you're going to die, you live forever. You live every single second of your life as if you lived forever. In other words, you live forever. That's your experience of life. You live forever. Only we don't. Only we know how powerless we are. Only we know how much at the mercy of the monstrous world out there we are. It's mighty difficult to be a human being. So when you taste the waters of not being a human being, that contrast may be experienced as very difficult, as very positive. But I dispute the notion that, the romantic notion that beyond death we all hold hands and sing the kumbaya. I see no reason to think that, because the place we are going to is this place. It's the place we are in right now. And just look around. Black holes swallow entire galaxies and whoever is alive in them. Stars go supernova and incinerate instantly whatever is within, what, 1,000 light years? Up to 20,000 light years, they can still incinerate you. You know, binary stars tear each other apart in a dance of death. I mean, it's that world we are going to. I'm not sure there is anything inherently positive. I think the suffering as we experience it is not there, because our suffering is predicated on the delusion of our being individual selves separate from the world. That delusion is guaranteed to go. That is off the table. But I'm not sure about inherent positivity. I'm too Schopenhauerian to think of inherent positivity in the primordial state of being. There was one more point I wanted to comment on. Oh, I forgot. Can you briefly summarize parts 1, 2, and 4? Very briefly, just keywords.
Qualitative character of the experience after death. If it's not like,
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I remember now. Again, it goes back to something I commented on before. And I understand it. It's mistaken, but I understand it. Because we think of ourselves as individual subjects. Look, for there to be experience, what there needs to be is a subject, not necessarily a dissociated, individuated subject. In other words, there has to be a subjectivity to which experience is given as a behavior of that subjectivity. There has to be an experiencer. There has to be a subject. So if there is something that is like to be mind at large after we die, then the subject has to be there. But that subject doesn't need necessarily to be in the particular configuration of being dissociated. You can have a subject that isn't dissociated, so long as the subject is in there. That's the first part of the comment. The second part is that because the only subject we have ever been, as far as we can remember, is a dissociated, individuated subject, we mistakenly attribute to every subject that particular characteristic of being individuated and dissociated. It probably takes years of spiritual discipline or a strong psychedelic trip in which you undergo ego dissolution for you to really know what it is like to be a subject that is not individuated at all. A subject that is just spread around and has no boundaries. If you have experienced that, then you know that it's entirely arbitrary to think of every subject as having to have a dissociated, bound, limited point of view. So that is not necessary. That bound is not necessary for there to be a quality after death. So I think there is qualities after death. It's all there is. All there is qualities. Because the subject after death is the subject that is looking out into the world from behind your eyes right now. We tend to think that it will be a different subject, that it's not really us. Then that's not what is implied. Just think of it as you're dreaming. When you're dreaming, you think you're your dream avatar. You are dissociated from the rest of your mind when you're dreaming. You think you are that little avatar going around the trees and cars, and the trees and cars are out there. No, the trees and cars are in your mind too. It's you doing the trees and the cars and the other people. It's the same subject. When you wake up, the dissociation ends, but you realize that you're still the same subject you were when you were in the dream. It is the same subject looking out to the waking world after you wake up as the one who was looking out through your dream avatar's eyes when you were experiencing the dreamed up cars and trees and other people during the dream. The subject is the same. The state of consciousness of the subject has changed. Your dream avatar was the subject in a dissociated state. The subject thought it was only the dream avatar and not the rest of the dream. Well, in fact, it was both. When you wake up, the subject stopped being dissociated, but the subject is the same. It's you. It's the you have always, ever been and can never cease to be, because it's the only thing that there is. So it is this understandable but pernicious intuition that because we cease being dissociated after we die, that somehow it's another subject. It's not really us. No, for the same reason that it's really you that was in the dream, and it's really you that wakes up from the dream. And after you wake up, you know that. You know it was you experiencing the dream through the dissociated eyes of the avatar. You don't think of your dream avatar as another person. No, it was you. You experienced that. Those experiences were given to you through the dissociated eyes of your dream avatar. And it's the same subject that is now experiencing the non-dissociated waking reality. Well, not dissociated to that same degree. So this is what is implied here. If you are to have any thought about your identity after you've gone through the state transition, the configuration of consciousness, that change in the configuration of consciousness that we call death, if you are to have any thought about your identity after you're dead, that thought will be this: oh shit, it was me all along. That will be your thought. It will not be, oh, that person died and it was not me. No, you don't say that about your dream avatar. When you wake up, you say, oh shit, it was me. I was doing the whole thing. You don't cease being you. It's not this abstract, oceanic subject that is alien to you. No, it's you. It's the thing that is looking out from your eyes right now. It's the thing you can never get rid of. You can never escape from. And that is the vertigo of eternity. That is the bad news. But you only get the bad news after you get the good news. And the good news is you're never going to die. This subject you are. There is nothing, not one thing about it that will cease to be. Ever. Ever. You have no escape from yourself. Zero chance. It's built into the fabric of reality that you have zero chance to escape from yourself. And that is the bad news. And that's what you realize after you understand why it's good news. The bad news comes very quickly afterwards.
And there's several people that have asked follow-on questions. And what I try and do sometimes is just pick someone who hasn't spoken yet today. So I think, Ivan, maybe you could also say what you had said and represent also a general feeling there as best you can.
Hi, Bernardo. Hi, Amir. In regards to what you just said, Bernardo, I had a similar question earlier when the topic came out. Doesn't the realization process of you dying and basically saying, oh, I was that thing all along, doesn't that imply metacognition? Because, for example, when I'm asleep, I have a perspective of me being me. If the dream shifts, I have a different perspective of me being me without remembering the previous dream. But I start to realize that I was dreaming only when I'm awake, and I can metacognize that I've been dreaming. So basically, how does that?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I chose my words carefully. What I said was, if you could have a thought about identity after you were dead, that thought would have been, oh shit, it was me all along. But if you could have a metacognitive thought about your identity after you're dead, can you, after you're really dead, I don't think you can generate new metacognitive thoughts. But we know now from science that death is a process, it's not instantaneous. It can last for hours, up to 8 hours. That's the last number I heard. And we know that because it can still be reversed partly, even hours afterwards. We know that your metabolism as we normally see it ends immediately, but there are other things that can restart potentially. So it is conceivable that the death process starts before your heart stops. If people who work in how you call hospices, they know what I'm about to tell you. People check out before their heart stops. Their eyes become glazed. Stress and worry seems to cease. They become very peaceful. What we call the death rattle, which is a horrible name, what it is a state of general physiological relaxation. That's why you rattle. Even the muscles in your respiratory and digestive tract that are not under voluntary control, they relax. Everything relaxed. You're still alive. Everything relaxed. And then, therefore, when you breathe, you have a rattle because everything is so relaxed it rattles. That is probably already our consciousness changing states, and we would find neurocorrelates of that. If when you become more advanced, we will find neurocorrelates of the beginning of the change in the state of consciousness that goes by the name of death. It's possible that it is in that phase when you are already delocalizing, but you still have higher level mental functions. It's possible that in that phase, a light goes up in your head and you go like, oh shit, I remember now how I ended up in this state and where I'm going to now, and it's really me. But it's a state that is already too deep for people to have motor control and start telling, because to be able to speak and tell these things, you really need to be dissociated and hear. And if you're already halfway there, no, there is no. There may be a very, very small window in which people can say something, and they probably know it, and it's probably the moment of highest clarity in their entire lives. And it's clear enough to them, probably, that they know that they can't discourse on it, that if they can say something, it has to be something very short. And what you'll probably hear is, it's okay. And then that's it. They'll summarize it in the nugget that is most important to say, like to say to their loved ones, don't worry, it's okay. And that's it. That's the last chance. Because the two opposite sides of the state are not compatible. You cannot have the realization of being less dissociated while having motor control to say something. You see, you can have an experience that spans both extremes, which I think people have. There's too much anecdotal evidence of a general state of relaxation at death, which a materialist would explain away easily, saying, well, it's physiology, the metabolism is slowing down, that's why it all relaxes. But as an idealist, whatever happens has to be a state of mind, because the state of mind is all there is. And a relaxation of the body implies a relaxation of the state of mind, which I tend to interpret as that still partly dissociated consciousness, still having some higher level mental functions, taking metacognitive notice, remembering metacognitively what is actually going on, where it was before it was born, where it's going to land now, well, where metaphorically, meaning which state of consciousness. And that emerging clarity, but that is incompatible with motor control, with your Broca's area, weaving narratives in words that you can tell your loved ones. Either you're here, you can say something, or you're not quite here anymore, and then you can't say anything. But death probably begins hours before the heart stops and goes on as a process hours before, hours after the heart stops. And it is in that period where you can still have metacognitive insights in a state of less dissociation. And so that's the sweet spot. Unfortunately, you can't come back and tell about it.
Yeah. I guess that's probably the near-death experience state, which is something that some people are able to report upon return.
Yeah, it takes a special conjunction of factors for you to, one, return after you're so deep in, and then still carrying the memory, still having some memory pathways, and then being back enough that you can metacognitively think about it on the mirror of memory. It's a conjunction of several factors there that it's probably rare. According to Pim van Lommel, it's 18% of the cases in cardiac arrest that people can say that. And of course, the question is, what about the other 82%? Do they not experience it, or they just don't remember? Pim thinks they don't experience it. I think they don't remember it. So, but yeah, if you have to trust someone, you're better off trusting Pim. But still, I still have my opinion.
Yeah. So just a quick summary to see if I got this correctly, because it was a contentious topic. So it's a process. It's a process of transitioning from a metacognitive state of consciousness onto what a non-metacognitive state of consciousness, which is mind at large, through a prolonged period of time in which the realization happens.
Yes. Let me give you an example from history that's very close to my heart. Goethe's death. Goethe died over a period of about 3 days in his home in Weimar, in a little chair, which I have had the honor to be able to touch at the Goethe archive and Goethe's house in Weimar. During the first 2 days, he was 82 years old, which in 1832 was, you were Methuselah, you were ancient. You had no business being alive at 82 in 1832. He knew he was dying. He died of pneumonia. We don't know for sure, but probably a lung infection because of a careless trip through carriage in the snow on a very cold winter day. He had tremendous pain in his chest and back, and he knew he was dying. And we know that because of there were a few people who saw them during that period. And his doctor, in particular, said that he could discern sheer terror in his eyes. He was absolutely terrorized because he knew he was going to die. But the death process hadn't started yet. He was still here, metacognitive enough to know he was going to die, and he was terrorized, terrified. In the final day, witnesses report that he nestled in comfortably on the left side. I have to visualize his room again to remember. Left side of his little chair next to his bed. And he had a very peaceful semblant. And he was very calm. He was not struggling anymore. He seemed very soothed. It looked like the pain stopped, and it looked like he was going to be okay again. But no, he was dying. And he saw something. He experienced something that made him realize that, oh, wait a moment, this is not what I thought it was. Oh, this is fine. It's all right. And we have enough evidence that although he was afraid of death, he was incredibly nostalgic about the world that existed in previous years of his life, and which no longer existed in 1832. If you look at the poem he wrote in the first edition of Faust, there's a powerful poem. If you can read it in German, read it in German.
I
In
have
English,
actually. It's really powerful. Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
very powerful poem. Um, and he expresses his nostalgia for the world he lost. And so he longed for the people who were no longer there. I mean, he lost everybody. He lost his wife, Christiane. He lost his lover before Christiane. He lost his son. He lost his best friend, the Duke. He lost the Duke's mother, who was one of his youth's lovers as well. He lost he lost his other best friend, Schiller. Uh, Goethe lost every single person he most cared about in his life. He lost his world. Um, Nobody at that time, very few people at that time, experienced so much loss as Goethe experienced. So I imagine, I fantasize that in the third day, the day he actually died, he achieved that clarity, terminal clarity. He remembered what was going on. And then he was looking forward to eternity because he was going back to the song that the needle of the record player had passed through already. You know, it was in the past, but where he was going, the record player existed in full. And I think that's why he nestled so cozily, so comfortably on the left side of the little chair. The little chair, if you look at it, it's tiny. The arms, and it's not really a proper armchair, two little thin wooden arms. And you think, no, how could anybody in find it comfortable to sit on this chair, you know, leaning to the left like he did? Well, he did. So in my fantasy, he had a good death. He deserved it. Goodness knows he deserved it.
Thank you for sharing that. By the way, that was touching, and thank you for the answer.
Cheers.
I'm just trying to find questions that close this topic. Well, nothing ever closes any topic off in the nature of these conversations, but one that doesn't suddenly generate helps people understand what's already been discussed rather than opening up new questions. So maybe Daniel.
Sure. Hello.
Hi, Daniel.
I'm very excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of your work, so it's an honor to be able to ask a question. I'll just read my question. Would it be fair to compare the raw subjectivity of mind and knowledge to an operating system with our individual perceptual systems functioning like apps? If so, how might the experience of listening to music be understood when the music lover dies? The audio file might still exist within MAL, but without the codec, the individual's perceptual and interpretive system to process it, does mind and knowledge still retain access to the musical experience?
As a computer engineer, I'm probably as tempted as you to make computer metaphors and try to understand things in terms of computer metaphors. Where this may go wrong here is that an operating system will have a resource scheduler, a task scheduler, and some processes may be running and later may not be running depending on how the task scheduler issues the processes. That is time dependent. What it is like to be Mao is per force not an experience in time. I am with Kant and Schopenhauer that time and space are our cognitive categories. They are the scales of our dashboard and not the dimensions of the world out there. I think the world out there is just a pure cognitive structure. And if that's the case, then whatever has ever been is. whatever can ever be is. There's only the is. And the codex, or the different processes that can be run, they are the inherent properties of universal consciousness, of the one thing that exists. Because philosophically, to be is to have properties. If you are, then you are one thing and not another. You are what you are and not something else that you conceivably could be. So to be is to be what you are. To be is to have properties, the properties you have. So if universal consciousness is, then it has properties. It is what it is, and therefore it behaves in the way it behaves because it is what it is. Those properties would then be intrinsic, inherent. If you want to think of them in terms of time, then they always are. The codec is always there. And it's always playing because it's outside time. The way to think about it, science allows us to play a very neat trick. We can swap time and space around because at core they are the same thing. And we've known that since general relativity in 1920s. So we can use that to guide our visualization. For instance, one of the difficulties in analytic idealism for people to visualize is when I say, the subject behind your eyes is the subject behind my eyes and everybody else's eyes. It's the same subject. And people go like, but how can one subject be in multiple spatial locations? That's difficult. So swap time for space. The subject behind your 5-year-old self, which is completely different from you right now, was you. You don't have difficulties understanding that. The subject behind your 5-year-old eyes was you. The subject behind your 15-year-old eyes was you. The subject behind your eyes now is you. It's the same subject. For the same reason that the same subject could have been behind your eyes at different points in time, the same subject is behind all of our eyes at different points in space, because space and time are the same thing. So that's one example where this transposition between time and space helps visualizing a philosophical conclusion. In the case that you are talking about, you do the opposite. You are thinking temporally. There is a codec playing a song, but after the song stops playing, the song has been played and the codec is not running anymore, then what is the experience of listening to a song? Well, transpose time to space now. Do the other way around. Think of Mal as being able to hear every song that has ever been played at the same time, but the speakers are in different positions in space. But Mao is listening to them all, and they can be told apart. I mean, if I am speaking to your left, you know that I am to your left. And if somebody is speaking to your right, you know that that person is to your right. And you can even distinguish the two voices. Even though if I put a speaker where you are, I get only one signal in the oscilloscope. But our minds can discern every instrument, every voice, every location in space, even though it's all happening at the same time. If you go to a concert, which I try to go at least a few times per year, you can discern the violin from the cello, from the brass, from the drums. You can discern it all from the flutes. But if you look at the signal that it's actually getting to your ear, it's only one signal, amplitude over time. But we can pick out these things happening at the same time and separate them in space. So the time problem you see in being Mao's outside time and space, but the way to visualize that is to transpose that to a spatial problem. Everything's happening at the same time, but in different locations in space, and Mao still differentiates them, just like I differentiate the cello from the violin playing at the same time. That's one way to visualize it. The right way to understand it is to ignore everything I just said, and it's just a cognitive structure. It's not an extended structure. It's a structure of meaning links of meaning. That's what it is. It's not in space, it's not in time, it's not extended. It's an all here now. But the now in the here has structure, and it's a cognitive structure of meaning.
If I enjoy a particular song, if I like a particular song, it has specific meaning, for me as an individual, a current aggregate, of different energies. When these energies dissolve into an ocean, I'm wondering if there's anyone to still experience this enjoyment of the particular song.
It is the same one that's listening to the song through you. Now, you see how we keep on coming back to this, and I understand it, because this is the great difficulty here. It's to understand that there is only one subject, and it's you, and everything else are states of you, states of consciousness. It's the same subject that listens to the song through your ears, and that will listen to the song in the mirror of memory, or in the mirror of the now, after Daniil Demchenko no longer exists. It's the same subject. It's not different from the subject right now. And because memories don't seem to have any physical correlate, no past state seems to have a physical correlate. We cannot go and measure the past directly. It stands to reason that all of your memories, including the memory of enjoying the song, will be there. Because the dissolution of a physical configuration has no bearing in a memory if a memory has no physical correlate. But the important thing to remember is that for the exact same reason, that it's the same you experiencing the dream from the eyes of your dream avatar as the you who wakes up and remembers a dream, in exactly the same way. It's you after you're dead, just like your dream avatar is dead when you wake up. It's toast.
Yeah, the difficult part for me here is that my dream avatar is very much like me in general. Like it's human typically, but here, the whirlpool is dissolving into something completely different, or what seems to be different.
This is perfectly normal to think that. But this is a prejudice that even materialist science has already gotten rid of. It is what you are, thus your character traits and preferences. It's a doing of what you are. It's not what you are. It's something you do. It's something you experiment with. It's something nature is experimenting with, putting you in that position. If you could magically be transposed to being behind the eyes of somebody else who you consider totally different from you, if you could experience that, you would know that it's the same you behind those eyes and thinking those thoughts and having those wishes. That's part of compassion as well. Did I do Amir, I have a thought experiment in which I try to slowly go from seeing the world from somebody else's eyes to thinking somebody else's thoughts. Did I do it already?
Yeah.
Okay, so think back to that. If you can really perform that thought experiment completely, you will understand, and that's the dangerous thing, that what you are is perfectly capable in the drop of a hat, in a moment, of being any other person and thinking any other person's thoughts and having any other person's preferences and having any other person's personality traits, including the ones you despise, the ones that you consider completely alien from you. If you do that thought experiment properly, you realize that all this stuff has nothing to do with being. It only has to do with doing. Some of the doings are immoral and should always be considered that. Nonetheless, we are each and every one perfectly capable of doing them. Even the things that are most alien to us. I've managed to go very far in visualizing and accepting that I could have tendencies, dispositions, and wishes that I consider heinous. Some I haven't managed to slip in those shoes. Some are too inaccessible to this particular configuration I'm doing right now. But I can see myself being angry to the point of seriously hurting someone. I can see myself indulging the mystical geopolitical abstraction that leads to war. I can see I can see myself in Putin's shoes, and that doesn't mean that I forgive him for what he's doing to the Russian people, first and foremost, the Russian man. But I have gone as far as accepting that the same I that is thinking what I think and judging the way I'm judging, that same I is perfectly capable of thinking what he's thinking. Sincerely, as I'm sure he is. He is sincere. He's not playing for the crowd. He's sincere in his beliefs. There are certain spaces in mind I cannot occupy. Perhaps because I find them so repulsive that I never give myself permission to occupy. And that has to do with doing something to children. Those are, no, I cannot enter those spaces. But if you've entered enough spaces, at some point you realize that you can be anyone, because in fact you are. you are everybody, and everybody is you, because there's only one you. And that becomes so clear that it becomes impossible for you to associate identity with particular thoughts, particular wishes, particular dispositions, because you know you can do any of them. Therefore, none of them is what you are. It is possible in life, without 30 years of meditation or a high-dose psychedelic trip, it is possible to see this very analytically.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just two things. One is, first of all, huge thanks, Bernardo, to you as always. I know you've been working really hard, and
the past few days were intense because I run Essential Foundation during the day, and I do Syncthetics mostly in the evening hours, and there are some people working during the day, but I do it in evening hours, so it comes at the cost of my sleep.
Depending on which way we look at it, we're 10 minutes over, finishing late this time, or we're 20 minutes under what we normally do, because we normally go half an hour over. But yeah, so wanting to give you the option, Bernardo, to hopefully get your 12-hour catch-up sleep.
If there is a question entirely related to what we were talking about and which has already been asked, I can take one more, and then you have 10 minutes for this discussion you mentioned.
Okay, so let's see if there's any reflections you could give to Carrie. So we're just finishing on like a more personal note, and then these kind of larger questions on multi-world theory, cessational consciousness, we can come to next week. And like I say, I can stay on the call for a little bit after Bernardo leaves. So Carrie, do you want to, because it continues on the theme of death and the process of dying, if you're still here. Oh, maybe she's signed off.
Can you ask the question?
Yeah, I'll ask, and hopefully she catches up on the recording. So her mom passed away from ALS, which is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Stephen Hawking's disease.
Stephen Hawking's had it, yeah.
Yeah, and she was wondering if you had any intuition about the causes, similar to how you've spoken about cancer. You've thought a lot about cancer. There's a whole video online on the Adventures in Awareness YouTube channel if you want to hear Bernardo's reflections on cancer. And you might have similar ideas or reflections.
I don't. I never thought about it. What I did think about was that the average lifespan from diagnosis to death with ALS is 2 to 3 years, and Stephen did like 60 almost. I did have some reflections on how that could have been possible, and my reflection was he never needed a body. It was not his daimonic thing. Actually, the body thing was a distraction. What nature wanted to do through him was a purely mind thing. Everything is mind, but you know what I mean, a really, really endogenous mind thing. So in his case, I can, the real answer is I have no idea, but since I'm being asked to speculate, my speculation was he was in peace with his condition because it was aligned with his daimonic drive. His mission was not impaired by his condition. On the contrary, he became a symbol of mental strength. He was a giant on a wheelchair that couldn't even speak. And that had tremendous symbolic value for us, for the rest of us. I mean, it was his sacrifice, but it had value for us. His sacrifice had a meaning because he showed us what it really means to be a giant and how disconnected from physicality it can be, or at times not. There are giants in MMA that I respect. I think of MMA as 3D chess played with the entire body with time control of a fraction of a second. And I think it's fantastic and it's very physical. And Stephen was a symbolic representation of the opposite extreme, which is equally valid. So these are my reflections on Stephen. Stephen is a second degree of acquaintance for me. I never met him, but I met several people who worked with him. So I have anecdotes, I know all kinds of stories about Stephen's past. And of course, as every human being, he had his shortcomings. He poo-pooed philosophy because he didn't understand what philosophy was or is. But he was a giant in science and theoretical science. Now, what ALS in general represents, if you look at it symbolically, and it's not an interpretation, let's just take account of what it is symbolically. It's a slow checking out. You slowly check out. What does that symbolize? I think I would do a disservice to anyone if I speculated further than that, because I don't know. And I could even be insulting to people depending on how I speculate here, because what you have to remember is that this is not a theoretical curiosity. It's a terrible condition that puts people through tremendous suffering. So I hesitate playing around with it like a theoretical subject or object that we can speculate about. I hesitate going too far. In cancer, I didn't hesitate because I think the symbolism is fairly clear, and the conclusion is encouraging and life affirming. So I didn't have a moral concern about being insulting to anyone, because it's a life affirming conclusion that gets rid of the terrible metaphor of our time, which is I'm battling cancer. Who are you battling? What is this other entity that you think you're battling? But in the case of ALS, I think it's a much trickier moral landscape and lots of minds. I don't want to do that. So I leave my reflections with Stephen.
Hi, Bernardo. I'm here. I don't know if you can hear me or see me now. I got everything fixed, but it's always so nice to be here with you. So thank you for that. It was, I know I respect that choice too on your part to not really play around with it, like you said, just because, yeah, it is a very difficult thing. I mean, I trusted your judgment. That's why I asked the question. It was, it's a very horrific disease that it's just, like you said, a long process of checking out. And it was just incredible. I mean, the meaning that I took from it was that once we finally got the diagnosis, we were able to have some meaningful moments with my mom, and we took meaning from that. But I still can't understand why your body would do that, or even if it's like a subconscious thing. And the one question I did have to ask too is that during my research for the disease, I came across an interesting little tidbit that some nurses and doctors in the field, when a patient would come in to have a possible diagnosis of ALS, they were like, "Oh no, I don't think that person has it." Like they would say it between themselves, because they're not nice enough. So it seems like there could be a little bit of a personality correlation there. And I was kind of interested in that because my mom definitely was very nice, sweet, very welcoming and warm. Although she had a really traumatic childhood, but it's a lot. So I don't know. It struck me as very interesting that those professionals would have that kind of intuition without even
so they associate ALS with some mild form of autism
or just being nice, like very nice.
So if you are nice, you don't have ALS? Is that how they think?
That's what they said. Yeah, like if you're just that kind of personality where you're just too nice.
Yeah.
And
when you are nice, you're engaged.
Yeah.
When you disengage, you're perceived as aloof and not nice.
Yeah.
But were you saying, Carrie, they associate being nice with...
Sorry, did I mess it up?
Well,
they said that... go ahead, Amir.
Yeah, clarify for us. Being nice is associated with
having the disease.
Oh, having the disease.
Having it, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So they'd have people come in and they just didn't kind of fit the personality type. And I mean, I'm sure there's no scientific papers on it, but I just came across it a few times in my readings. And
actually, there is some, not exactly scientific, but anecdotal. This guy, Gabor Mate, he writes a lot about this thing.
Yeah.
There is something in that way. Yeah. Even something that's aligning with scientific. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So it was just interesting to me, and I wanted to, hear your perspective.
I'll make a general comment. As empathic as we can be, it is never really possible to experience life from somebody else's eyes. We all, at least I had that tendency for a long time, and it took decades for me to break away from this. My friends noticed that in me much earlier than I did. I have the tendency to think that everybody is more or less like me from the inside. I think it's very human to do that. You know, you're talking to another human, you assume that's your first reflex, that everybody's more or less like you from the inside. But because we all assume that, we may be living in very disjoint realities in this regard. It may be something very different to be somebody else. And therefore, it's very difficult for us to collect statistics on correlations between our inner states of mind and physical conditions we may develop, because we don't have access to the former. We don't have real access to the inner state of somebody else. There was research done years ago that found a correlation between repressed anger and higher likelihood of cancer, all forms of cancer, which sounds very reasonable from an idealist perspective, because if there is internalized anger, that anger is channeled at your own system, and anger is the opposite of love, which brings things together. Anger sort of breaks things apart, dissociation, right? But if you look at how they scored people for repressed anger, they were the people who did not manifest any anger. Now, how do you then differentiate people with repressed anger from people who are genuinely not angry, right? And that shows the methodological difficulty in establishing these correlations between a diagnosis and the inner states of feeling and thinking that may correlate with that diagnosis. It's nearly impossible to do that. So it's entirely plausible if someone says cancer correlates with repressed anger, and it's just as plausible as someone who says cancer correlates with love, because we don't really have access to what it is like to be somebody else, and this person cannot tell it to us because that person too assumes that what it is like to be them is more or less the same as what it is like to be everybody else. So nobody has access to a difference between foreground and background that would give us insight into, oh my God, it turns out that I actually feel a lot more angry than most other people. We can't know that. So I can't tell other people that I feel more angry than most people. So you see what I mean? It's a methodological impossibility. There may very well be these correlations. They may actually be quite clear. And they may be what we expect or something entirely else. But with the current methodologies we have, it is impossible to make the assertion, because none of us knows that we are different from anybody else, because we are the only things we can really inhabit. You see? So it becomes even difficult for us to try to prevent a condition by adjusting our inner life, because we don't know which way to adjust. We don't know where to know in which direction. How do we turn the knobs? Do we turn the knobs clockwise or anti-clockwise? So for me, the way I sort out this dilemma, which I have thought deeply about during my years of anxiety, is to completely let go of it, is to acknowledge that I cannot know. All I can do is to follow the daimon with moral supervision. And that's it. That's it. Hope for the best. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bernardo. Thanks.
Cheers.